Imagine walking across a quiet field outside a medieval city. The grass looks peaceful. The stone walls of the city still stand. There are no soldiers. No horses. No weapons. Nothing appears unusual. But beneath the ground are hundreds of human skeletons. Some still wearing pieces of armor. Some still carrying the wounds that killed them. Skulls split by powerful blows. Legs cut through by weapons. Bones pierced by arrows and crossbow bolts. And some bodies showing multiple injuries from different directions. These were not the remains of a forgotten cemetery. They were the victims of one of the most brutal medieval battles ever uncovered by archaeology. The Battle of Visby. It took place on the Swedish island of Gotland in the summer of 1361. More than 6 centuries later, the skeletons buried outside the walls of Visby are still revealing what happened on that terrible day. And modern researchers are now using experimental archaeology, biomechanics, and ancient DNA research to investigate the people who fought and died there. This is the story of the Battle of Visby. Welcome to History Uncovered. Gotland, the island worth fighting for. To understand the Battle of Visby, we first need to understand Gotland. Today, Gotland is a Swedish island in the Baltic Sea. But during the Middle Ages, its location made it extremely valuable. The island sat in the middle of important Baltic trade routes. Merchants passed through its waters. Goods moved between Scandinavia, the Baltic region, and the wider European world. At the center of this activity stood Visby. Visby was a wealthy and heavily fortified medieval city. Its enormous stone ring wall surrounded the city. Inside were merchants, craftsmen, warehouses, churches, and homes. Visby had become one of the most important trading centers in the Baltic. But outside the city walls lived another population. The people of the Gotland countryside. Many were farmers. They were not professional soldiers. And in 1361, their island became the target of a powerful king. His name was Valdemar Atterdag, the king of Denmark. The Danish invasion. In the summer of 1361, Valdemar Atterdag launched an invasion of Gotland. His goal was not simply to raid the island. He wanted control. The Danish army landed on Gotland and began moving across the island toward Visby. The invading force included experienced professional soldiers and mercenaries. They were trained for warfare. They were equipped with weapons and armor. And they had already fought in other campaigns. The defenders were very different. Gotland's countryside was threatened. Local people were called upon to defend their island. Among them were farmers. There were adults. There were older men. And evidence suggests that even boys were among those who fought. This was not a professional army meeting another professional army. It was a desperate local defense against a well-equipped invading force. And that difference would become one of the most important factors in what happened next. The first clash. The Danish army did not simply walk directly into Visby. Before reaching the city, the invaders encountered resistance. One important confrontation took place near Massacre in the southern part of Gotland. The local Gotlandic forces attempted to stop the Danish advance. But they failed. Archaeological discoveries from the area, including weapons and pieces of equipment, have helped researchers investigate this earlier fighting. The Danish army continued toward Visby. For the defenders, the situation was becoming desperate. The enemy was approaching the city, and thousands of people were preparing for the final confrontation. July 27, 1361. On July 27, 1361, the decisive battle took place outside the walls of Visby. The Gotlandic defenders gathered near the city. They had a massive advantage in motivation. They were fighting for their homes. But motivation could not compensate for everything. The Danish force had experienced soldiers. The defenders were less uniformly equipped. Some carried older weapons and armor. Some had little protection. and many were simply not trained for the realities of professional medieval warfare. Then the armies collided. The battlefield became chaos. Metal struck metal. Arrows and crossbow bolts flew through the air. Swords and axes struck exposed limbs. People fell. And once a wounded fighter was on the ground, the danger was not over. The armor problem. One of the most fascinating things about the Visby skeletons is what they reveal about medieval armor. Armor protected the most important parts of the body, but it did not make a person invincible. The torso could be protected by chainmail and shields, but the arms and legs were often more vulnerable. And the skeletons show exactly what happened. Many of the most severe injuries are concentrated on the limbs and skulls. Some bones were cut. Others were shattered. In one particularly dramatic case, both lower legs were severed by a powerful strike. The skeletons show that medieval combat was not the clean sword fight often portrayed in movies. It was chaotic, exhausting, and extremely violent. The mass graves. After the battle, the dead were buried quickly. Outside the city walls, large mass graves were created. Today, these graves are known as the Korsbättningen mass graves. Archaeologists eventually discovered several graves containing extraordinary numbers of skeletons. 3 of the excavated graves contained approximately 1,185 individuals. And the remains were unusually well preserved. Why? Because many of the victims had been buried rapidly. Some were still wearing parts of their armor. Weapons and armor fragments were found alongside the bodies. The graves became an extraordinary archaeological time capsule. Instead of reconstructing the battle only from written documents, researchers could examine the bodies themselves. The skeletons had recorded the violence, and their bones were still carrying that record. The skeletons become witnesses. A written medieval account can exaggerate. A chronicler can make an army look stronger. A king can describe a victory as glorious. But bones are different. A healed fracture can reveal an old injury. A cut-through bone can reveal the direction of a weapon. A projectile embedded in a skeleton can reveal what kind of weapon was used. Multiple injuries can reveal how a person was attacked. The skeletons of Visby became silent witnesses. And some of their stories are horrifying. Researchers have found skulls with numerous cuts and holes. Some individuals suffered injuries from multiple directions. Others were struck repeatedly. The pattern suggests that some fighters were attacked by more than one opponent or were struck with different weapons during the same encounter. The terrifying leg injuries. One of the most revealing parts of the Visby evidence is the large number of injuries to the legs. This makes sense when we consider medieval armor. A heavily protected warrior could be difficult to kill through the torso. The legs were more vulnerable. A fighter who could no longer stand was effectively removed from the battle. The skeletons suggest that some wounded men may have been attacked again after falling. This is one reason the Visby battlefield is so disturbing. The injuries do not simply tell us that people were fighting. They show us how the fighting worked. First, an opponent could be wounded, then disabled, then finished. It was not necessarily a single dramatic sword strike. It could be a sequence of attacks. The mystery of the square skull injuries. But one of the most fascinating discoveries concerns unusual square-shaped injuries found on some skulls. For years, researchers debated what caused them. Were they produced by arrows, lances, some unusual weapon? The shape was difficult to explain. And this is where modern science entered the story. Researchers recently used experimental archaeology to recreate the conditions of medieval combat. They studied the injuries. They reconstructed weapons. They used motion capture technology. And they tested different possibilities. The research suggested that some of these unusual injuries were consistent with blows from a spiked club. a weapon designed to deliver a devastating impact. This was not simply a matter of looking at a skull and guessing. Researchers compared reconstructed injuries with the archaeological evidence, and the results offered a new interpretation of what may have happened on the battlefield. Recreating the battle. Imagine trying to understand a medieval battle by studying only the broken bones. You know where the injuries occurred, but you do not know exactly how the weapon moved. You do not know how fast the attacker was moving. You do not know whether the victim was standing, falling, or already wounded. Experimental archaeology tries to solve this problem. Researchers recreate weapons. They recreate armor. They test materials. And they reproduce movements. In the recent Visby research, modern motion capture technology was used to analyze reconstructed combat. This allowed researchers to study the movement of a fighter delivering blows. The goal was not to recreate the battle for entertainment. It was to understand the biomechanics behind the injuries. How much force was required? From what direction did the blow come? What weapon could produce that shape of damage? And what did those injuries tell us about medieval combat? The answers can completely change how we understand the battlefield. Were the Gotlanders really just untrained farmers? For a long time, the traditional story was simple. The Danish army consisted of professional soldiers. The Gotlandic defenders were poorly equipped farmers. The Danes arrived. The farmers were overwhelmed, and thousands died. There is truth in this basic picture. But modern research is making the story more complicated. The mass graves show that the Gotlandic force was not simply a random crowd. There were different types of equipment. There were people with different ages and physical conditions. There were different types of injuries. And there is evidence of organized fighting. The recent experimental research also raises questions about how disciplined medieval militia forces could be. So the defenders may have been less militarily organized than the Danish army. But that does not mean they were completely untrained. The people behind the bones. This is where the story becomes more human. It is easy to look at 1,185 skeletons and see a number. But every skeleton belonged to a person. Someone had a family. Someone had a home. Someone had worked. Someone had friends. Some were young. Some were older. Some had injuries from earlier periods of their lives. And then in 1361, they came to Visby. Perhaps some believed they could stop the invasion. Perhaps others had no choice. Perhaps they were protecting their families. Whatever their reasons, many never returned home. Their bodies were placed together in mass graves. Their names disappeared. But their bones survived. The children and the elderly. One of the most disturbing aspects of the battle is the broad range of people who appear to have participated. The Gotlandic force was not composed exclusively of young, professional warriors. Evidence indicates that men of different ages took part. This tells us something important about medieval society. When an invasion threatened the island, defense could become a community responsibility. The line between civilian and soldier was not always as clear as it is today. A farmer could become a fighter. An older man could be called to defend his community. A young person could be placed in danger. And when the Danish army arrived, the entire social structure of Gotland was affected. What happened inside Visby? One of the great questions surrounding the battle is why the city's inhabitants did not save the people fighting outside. The massive walls of Visby provided protection. The defenders outside were fighting near the city. Yet the battle ended with a devastating defeat for the Gotlandic force. Historical tradition and later accounts describe a city forced to surrender. The Danish king eventually entered Visby as the victor. The countryside had been devastated. The defenders had suffered enormous losses. And Gotland came under Danish control. The battle had changed the island forever. Valdemar's victory. For Valdemar Atterdag, the Battle of Visby was a military victory. But the real objective was political. Control of Gotland meant control of an important Baltic island. Visby had enormous economic importance. The conquest strengthened Danish influence in the Baltic. The battlefield outside the walls, therefore, represented much more than a single battle. It was part of a wider struggle over trade, territory, and political power. Thousands of people died. A kingdom expanded. And a medieval trading center was forced to accept a new political reality. Why were the dead buried so quickly? Another question concerns the mass graves themselves. Why were so many bodies placed together? Why were some still wearing armor? The answer may be partly practical. After a battle involving huge numbers of dead, leaving bodies on the battlefield was dangerous. The dead needed to be removed. The graves outside Visby allowed the bodies to be buried quickly. But the fact that armor remained on some individuals provides archaeologists with extraordinary information. Usually, battlefield equipment is separated from human remains. Armor is removed. Weapons are collected. Bodies are stripped before burial. At Visby, however, some equipment remained with the dead. That makes the graves unusually valuable for researchers. The medieval battlefield preserved in bone. The Visby graves give us something extremely rare. A direct connection between human remains and battlefield equipment. The bones tell us about trauma. The armor tells us about protection. The weapons tell us about combat. Together they create a picture. Researchers can compare the location of injuries with the parts of the body that armor protected. They can examine which weapons were present. They can study the direction of cuts. They can even investigate the age and health of the people who died. In this way, the battlefield becomes almost like a forensic investigation. Except the crime happened more than 600 years ago. Ancient DNA, the next chapter. There is another field that could change the story even further. Ancient DNA. Researchers are now interested in using genetic analysis on the human remains from the battle. The goal is to learn more about who these people were. Where did they come from? Were they local Gotlanders? Were some from other parts of Scandinavia? Did the Danish army include fighters from distant regions? Could genetic evidence reveal family relationships? These are questions that written history may never answer. DNA may provide another layer of evidence. It could transform the skeletons from anonymous victims into individuals with geographic and biological histories. The Battle of Visby revisited. Modern researchers have increasingly returned to the Battle of Visby. A 2025 research symposium brought together archaeologists, historians, bioarchaeologists, and specialists in experimental archaeology. They discussed the mass graves, the victims, the weapons, the injuries, the burial practices, and the armies involved. This renewed interest is important because the battle was once treated as a straightforward medieval massacre. Today, researchers are asking more complicated questions. Who were the people in the graves? How were they organized? How did they fight? How did they die? Why were they buried the way they were? And what can their remains tell us about medieval society? The dark truth about medieval warfare. The Battle of Visby also destroys one romantic idea about medieval warfare. Movies often show battles as heroic sword fights between knights. Real warfare was different. It was exhausting. It was chaotic. It was terrifying. People were wounded. They fell. They were trampled. They were attacked from different directions. And the difference between life and death could depend on whether a piece of armor protected one part of the body. The Visby skeletons remove the romance. They show us the physical reality. A sword does not simply hit. It cuts bone. A projectile does not simply fly. It can remain embedded inside a human body. A club does not simply strike. It can fracture a skull. The bones do not exaggerate. They record the final hours. Imagine the final hours of the battle. The Gotlandic defenders have been fighting for hours. Their weapons are damaged. Their bodies are exhausted. Some are already wounded. The Danish soldiers continue advancing. The city walls stand behind the defenders. Perhaps some men try to reach the gates. Perhaps others attempt to escape. But the battlefield is closing around them. The injuries found on the skeletons suggest that some were attacked from behind. Others were struck in the limbs. Others suffered multiple blows to the head. The battle was becoming less about formation and more about survival. And for many, survival was impossible. After the battle, on July 29, only 2 days after the battle, Valdemar entered Visby as the victor. The city surrendered. The countryside had paid an enormous price. The dead were buried. The weapons disappeared. The battlefield became quiet. The grass grew again. And eventually, the people of later generations walked over the ground without knowing exactly what was beneath their feet. Centuries passed. The medieval world disappeared. But the dead remained. The graves open again. In the early 20th century, archaeologists began excavating the mass graves. What they discovered shocked the archaeological world. Hundreds of skeletons, weapons, armor, and evidence of extraordinary violence. The graves provided one of the most detailed physical records of medieval battlefield injuries ever discovered. The skeletons became famous. They were no longer simply the dead of a forgotten battle. They became evidence. Evidence that could be studied again and again as technology improved. And that is exactly what happened. From archaeology to biomechanics, early archaeologists could observe the wounds. Modern scientists can do much more. They can scan bones, create digital models, measure angles, analyze materials, reconstruct weapons, simulate movements, and compare experimental injuries with archaeological trauma. This means that a skull from Visby can be studied using methods that medieval people could never have imagined. A weapon strike that happened in 1361 can be reconstructed in the 21st century. The past and present meet in the laboratory. What the skeletons cannot tell us. But there are limits. Bones cannot tell us exactly what a person was thinking. They cannot tell us the final words of a dying soldier. They cannot tell us whether someone was afraid. They cannot tell us the full sequence of every individual attack. And they cannot answer every historical question. This is why archaeology must work together with written records, artifacts, and scientific analysis. The strongest historical conclusions come when different kinds of evidence agree. And when they do not agree, researchers must admit uncertainty. That is not a weakness. It is what makes historical research credible. The bigger story. The Battle of Visby was not simply a massacre. It was the result of political ambition, economic interests, military strategy, geography, and the vulnerability of a population caught between a powerful invading army and the defense of its homeland. The skeletons are the final chapter of that story. But the story began long before the battle. It began with Gotland's importance in the Baltic. It continued with the rise of Visby. It reached a turning point when Valdemar decided to invade. And it ended outside the walls of the city. A message from 1361. Perhaps the most powerful thing about the Visby graves is that they make the Middle Ages feel unexpectedly close. We often imagine medieval history as something distant. Kings, castles, knights, wars. But the skeletons remind us that these were real people. They had bones like ours. They suffered injuries like ours. They had families. They had hopes. And they lived in a world where a political decision made by a king could suddenly place ordinary people in the middle of a war. The mass graves are therefore more than archaeological sites. They are human stories. The mystery still unfolds. More than 700 years after the Battle of Visby, we still do not know everything. New scientific methods are revealing details that earlier researchers could not see. Ancient DNA may reveal where individuals came from. Experimental archaeology may reveal how specific weapons were used. Digital scanning may uncover injuries hidden inside bones. And every new study can change our understanding of the battle. The dead are still speaking. We simply need better ways to listen. Final conclusion. On July 27, 1361, outside the walls of Visby, two very different forces met. A professional Danish army led by King Valdemar Atterdag, and a local Gotlandic force trying to defend its homeland. The result was devastating. Thousands of people died. Many were buried rapidly in mass graves. Their armor remained beside them. Their weapons disappeared into the earth. And the battlefield became silent. For centuries, nobody knew exactly what the graves would reveal. Then archaeologists opened them. They found skulls shattered by powerful blows, legs cut by weapons, bones pierced by projectiles, and bodies carrying the physical evidence of medieval warfare. Today, researchers are using technology unimaginable in 1361 to reconstruct what happened. They're studying biomechanics, weapons, armor, trauma, DNA, and the identities of the dead. The Battle of Visby was once simply a date in medieval history. Now, thanks to archaeology, it has become something much more. It is a battlefield preserved in bone. A war recorded not only by kings and chronicles, but by the bodies of the people who were there. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of Visby. History is not always written by the winners. Sometimes, history is written in the bones of the dead. 7 centuries later, those bones still have a story to tell. This is History Uncovered. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep uncovering history.